Hello again. Now we're up to chapter 15, which is entitled European Monarchies and Absolutism. So, as I mentioned back in the last chapter, absolutism basically meant is that the monarch is going to control everything. They're going to control every single aspect. They're the ones that are going to be able to call for war. They're the ones that are going to be able to renew taxes, implement different taxes for various things. So, because of the power of absolutism, Europe is going to kind of be in a period of total chaos at this point in time. And mind you, this is post all the wars that were going on. So as we mentioned, there were civil wars that were brewing out. We had the 30 Years' War that occurred as well. So we're going to talk about what ends up happening within France and the other nations as well because of absolutism. So let's talk about France first. So France at this point in time had Louis XIV. So Louis XIV, instead of traditionally ruling out of Paris, ended up moving his palace to Versailles, which still exists. You could still go see it if you want to. So he basically relied on the upper class and the bourgeoisie. So the fine, I guess you can say the fine, happy, well-to-do people were basically well off in France. They weren't highly taxed. He basically depended on them for everything. On the other hand, he ended up highly taxing the commoners, so your common people. The reasons why he needed to tax these people was he needed his large standing army. Heaven forbid England decided to come again and start a war with them. He also contributed to the head tax, which basically meant is that every single person would have to pay a tax on their head. So basically an individual, I guess you could say personal income tax on you. He also taxed salt, which was known as the gabelle. He also placed a tax on wine and tobacco. And of course, as I mentioned, nobility were exempt from taxation. So can you see what's kind of brewing in France at this point in time? You basically have the well-to-do people that are doing fine, that are not being taxed, and then you have your common man that's actually being taxed. So this is going to cause maybe possibly another rift or a potential civil war as well within France, because you have the commoners that are being, taxed to a certain extent and the nobility not being taxed. So just keep that in mind. So of course, like I mentioned here, the peasantry, of course, are going to be cut off. They're going to be overtaxed. They're going to feel the crunch from that. There's also going to be a lot of religious divisions that are going on in France, very similarly to what we discussed earlier. So predominantly there's going to be Catholic, but there's also going to be conflicts led against the Protestant Huguenots. So as I mentioned before, the Huguenots were the Protestants. They could be Calvinists. They could be, Lutheran, whoever's within that group. Okay, so that's what's going on in the forefront in France at this point in time. So let's jump into England. So England is going to deal with the Glorious Revolution of 1688. And basically this has to do with the monarchy. Okay, so the monarchy was limited by Parliament, and it was also asking for the monarch to follow the Magna Carta that I talked about before. So kind of keeping a checks and balances system on the monarchy. They did not want the monarch to become too powerful. That was something that was completely considered, I guess you can say, unparliamentary, unconstitutional at this point in time. They needed that checks and balances system. So if you remember the Charles II that we talked about before, he was succeeded by his Catholic brother named James II. So mind you, James is Catholic, so please keep that in mind. So he caused, once again, religious issues, because you once again have now a Catholic ruler, and there's a lot of Protestant people within England at this point in time. So it caused a lot of religious rift. So James actually fled to exile in France because of the issues that he ended up causing. So the people that are going to succeed him, of course, are William and Mary. So we're talking about William of Orange and Mary Stuart. And of course, they're Protestant, so keep that in mind as well. Parliament is also going to pass the Bill of Rights. So the Bill of Rights is going to give the people of England, specifically males, various rights that were important. So, of course, allowing trial by jury, so they can be heard of a court case by a jury of their peers. It also put into play habeas corpus and other things as well. They also instituted the Act of Toleration of 1689, which basically allowed the freedom of worship. So this was something that we haven't seen before. Even at the time of Henry VIII, Henry VIII wanted people to follow whatever religion he wanted. And mind you, he toggled back between, being Catholic and then, of course, later on forming the Church of England. So because of that, there was a little bit of, with William and Mary, a little bit of, I guess you could say, relief in terms of the English people feeling that. They're going to be a little bit happier with that as well. This is going to lead also to the Glorious Revolution, which basically led to a mixed monarchy that was governed by the king and parliament according to the rule of law. So it kind of, like I mentioned, created that checks and balances system in England that they really wanted and that they really, really needed as well. The text also talks about John Locke and his theory of government, so please take a look at that. Please review that as well. They also talk about the War of Spanish Succession, and basically in 1713 that war ended with the Treaty of Utrecht. So the book does talk about that as well, even though it's just a little paragraph, but they do talk about that too. Let's talk about Central and Eastern Europe, because we haven't placed any focus on that area at all within the past, 2 chapters. So you have the Austrian Habsburg Empire. So this is going to come into fruition after the Holy Roman Empire. So if you remember back from 2 chapters ago, the Holy Roman Empire is not considered Germany. It's basically an empire that has loose thousands of little provinces, and each province is ruled by a prince. And each prince can then determine their religious government. So whether they want it to be, Catholic, Lutheran, Protestant, Calvinist, whatever religion they wanted, depended solely on that prince at that point in time. As the Holy Roman Empire started to disperse, we have the Austrian Habsburg Empire start to come to fruition. Okay. And then you also have a territory known as Brandenburg Prussia as well. So these are kind of the forefronts of the main provinces. They're kind of starting to expand and kind of get bigger as well. So just keep that in mind. In terms of Russia, so Russia at this point in time was led by Tsar Peter I, so also known as Peter the Great. Peter the Great was given that title because what he wanted to do was he wanted to modernize Russia, because Russia was considered kind of like, I guess you could say, the black sheep of Europe at this point in time. So Peter the Great wanted to instill this grand method of modernizing his Russian people and also bringing them to the forefront, kind of making them more in tune with what is going on in Western Europe. Peter also focused on expansion. So Russia at this point in time isn't this massive country that it is today. So they focus specifically on imperial expansion. So if you look at Russia on a map at this point in time, it's surrounded by frozen Arctic waters to the north. So that's not going to do them justice as they're trying to expand. It's also not going to help them when they're trying to trade. So what Peter wanted was he wanted imperial expansion toward the Black Sea and the Baltic Sea, because both of those seas are not frozen. So you can easily maneuver and trade and bring ships in and out. He also wanted to push against the Ottoman Empire, which resided specifically in Turkey, which is, of course, close to the Black Sea, and then, of course, into the Middle East as well. So he just basically wanted to expand his empire and do so in such a specific manner. And he was successful in doing so for a period of time. Okay, so what I wanted you to do is within this chapter, just focus on the successes of different empires at this point in time and take a look at what absolute monarchy really is. Think about it in terms of Peter, think of it in terms of William and Mary, and the other rulers that we talked about. What was so important as to why they were so successful as rulers of their countries at this point in time. So just take a look at that as you're going through the chapter. All right, thank you.